A good Erev Shabbos. How's everybody doing? Having a little bit of glitch book issues. I think Nina was not able to get it on Facebook. Hopefully she has by now, but I was just sharing it to the AT forum and other groups. Let's light up the darkness. Look what I got from my daughter. Isn't this sweet? Oops, this way. I'm kvelling. It's so sweet. She's actually in Israel now, but she left that with me. Today is my birthday. I should have done this on my Hebrew birthday. I forgot, so I'm just doing it on my secular birthday. I bless you, my holy sisters and brothers, that you should be matzliach, you should be successful and healthy and find meaning and prosperity and strength in all your endeavors. I'm so glad that we're learning together. And I bless you and me. I bless us that we should all be learning together to 120 years of age. And we say Amen. Our daf today. Oh, wait, who's in the house? Not so many people are in the house. Fridays are always tough. Holiday Friday especially. Sharon in New Jersey. Renee wishing us a good Shabbos. Gordo in Scotland. Joe in the Inland Empire. Joseph in Massachusetts. Melissa in Great Neck. Karen. Wait a minute. It skipped on me. Melissa in Great Neck. Joseph says happy birthday. Thank you. Renee says Yom Haledet Sameach. Thank you. And Karen says happy birthday. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it. And over there on the YouTube side, Ella says shalom. Lynn in the house. Marjorie in Georgia. Aoife, thank you for the birthday greetings. Poanikaton? I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Saying shalom from the Bronx. Awesome. Facebook is not loading, so I came over here. I wonder what's going on with Facebook. Of course, on this day, when everybody else seems to be having problems with Facebook, my Facebook is working. Glitch book, as Bill likes to call it. It's absolutely glitch book. Hopefully it starts working. It's feeding back for me good. I don't know what's going on. You know, one thing that I have found useful, we sometimes get in the habit of just putting things to sleep and not shutting them down, you know, your computer, your phone. From time to time, you got to just power down, shut the whole thing down, and let it boot back up. Things tend to run a little bit more smoothly when we do that. Hopefully that is useful. All right, hopefully people will find it and be able to run the video. Our daf today is relatively short, albeit challenging. This is daf Lamed Aleph, page 31, here in Tractate Gittin, the 19th volume of the Talmud, the laws of divorce. We are, with today's class, God willing, completing chapter 3. And the final Mishna of chapter 3 is Mishna number 9. Seemingly unrelated to the laws of divorce, but we saw that once we got onto the subject of an agent delivering a bill of divorce, and he got the get from a husband who is elderly or possibly even sick or very sick at death's door. And then we have an issue. Do we deliver a get if we have reason to believe that the husband who sent it might be dead? Because if he is dead, the woman became a widow. She cannot become divorced. And so we saw some laws pertaining to when we can have a presumption that a person is still alive. And that led us into some other areas of Jewish law where we can have a presumption of other subjects that really have nothing to do with divorce law. But once we got on this subject of, we have reason to believe because the last time we saw such and such, we have no reason to believe that such and such has changed, so we may make a legal presumption that the status quo remains and act accordingly. And we'll see that today's Mishnah relates to this kind of concept. Mishna number 9 here in chapter 3. Now Facebook glitches. Okay, I think it's an okay glitch. Mishnah number 9. With regard to one who sets aside produce with the understanding that he will separate terumot and tithes with it, so that when he has untithed produce, he can render it fit by declaring that the teruma and the tithes that must be separated will be from the produce that he set aside for this purpose. Or one who sets aside money with the understanding that he will separate and redeem second tithe with it, then he may later separate the teruma or tithe with them, based on the presumption that the produce or the money are extant. What are we talking about? So, when the temple was standing in Jerusalem in ancient Israel, and every farmer had an obligation to tithe all the produce, as well as winemakers, right? The types of materials that had to be tithed. But let's just talk about produce from a field, let's say a wheat field. And so when he gathers in the harvest, so 2% of that wheat that he gathers is have to go to a priest. That is teruma, consecrated food that only priests can eat in a state of purity. That food is considered holy. Then the next 10% is meiser, the tithe. The word tithe, it means the tenth. And it's that tenth of the produce that is given to the Levite, because all the other tribes receive portions of land in the land of Israel. But the Levite tribe, their portion was God, and God is their portion. And so they serve and do not receive land, but they do receive a tithe from the rest of the nation. And then the second tithe is 10% of what is remaining after the tithe is given to the first tithe is given to the Levite, and the second tithe, in the years 1 and 2 and 4 and 5 of the 7-year sabbatical cycle, that second tithe is used to fund the pilgrimage for the pilgrimage festivals. Passover, Shavuos, and Sukkot, when the people would ascend to Jerusalem, and they would use that second tithe to eat and drink and be merry while they're on that pilgrimage festival in Jerusalem. And in years 3 and 6 of the 7-year sabbatical cycle, that second tithe was given to the poor. Now, what they're talking about here in this Mishnah is that when one is tithing, he might think to himself, I want to make sure that I don't mess up. I want to be scrupulous in setting aside my tithes. By the way, in modern times, the way we tithe is that we set aside 10% of our net income and give it to proper charities that we can believe in, particularly, sheltering, feeding, clothing, the needy, especially tending to their educational needs. Etc. We give to worthy charities. That's how we tithe. But at any rate, somebody says, I want to be scrupulous and make sure that I don't mess up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tithe in advance. Tithe in advance, how does he do that? Well, he sets aside a bunch of produce, more than he needs to tithe at that moment that he's got this produce. And he says that this produce is going to function as, call it my tithe stack, right? I'm just making up that term. But the idea is, and as his tithes become due, it's already been set aside. What's set aside as a tithe stack will be given to a Levite, all of it. But as other produce, is gathered, he can say, okay, I've already set aside the tithe for it. He's going to have to keep track how much he put in the original stack and how much he needs to tithe each time. But it's already been set aside so that he won't forget it's done, right? And so this is permissible. You can tithe in advance this way. But what is the presumption that we're talking about? Well, when you set aside that produce early on, at the beginning of the process, to serve as the tithe of produce that will be gathered later, you have to make sure that what you set aside remains in existence. If the wind blew it away, if it rotted, if something went wrong with it, if it was stolen, etc. So now that tithe doesn't exist anymore, right? You put it in your stack, but you never gave it to the Levite. So it's not going to work to fulfill the obligation of tithing the produce that comes in later. So at some point you're going to have to check on it and make sure it's still there. But as a general matter, if you put it away in a safe place, you can assume that it's still there. You can presume that it's still there, and that it functions as the tithe that will perform the tithing obligation of the produce gathered later. So he need not be concerned that perhaps the produce or the money was lost in the meantime. If he does discover that they were lost, then he must be concerned that the produce or money that he set aside was lost from the time until the time, right? So that's the odd phrase that the Gemara is going to focus on. What does it mean, right? So once you discover that the tithe you set aside early to, exempt all these other produce from tithing because it's done already, but it was lost or stolen, something went wrong with it. So then the question comes up, well, when I first set it aside, it was good, it was there, all of it was there. I checked on it later and it was gone. Okay, so the issue is, when did it become lost or stolen and unavailable? I used it in my mind, let's say, to exempt the obligation or to fulfill the obligation of all this other produce that came in later. At what time between when I first put it over there and when I checked and learned that it was gone, when did it go wrong? When was it stolen? When did it rot? When did it, go bad? Can I make assumptions like, well, I used that stack of pre-tithed grain, or, you get what I'm saying. I used that stack 3 times, right? I gathered in 3 harvests and used it and said, oh, okay, well, the tithe for this harvest is going to come from that tithe stack that I set aside before. And then I learned that this was no good. So was the first harvest tithe properly, but the second and third were not? Or was the first and second tithe properly, but the third was not? From when can I assume that this was still good? And at what point do I need to assume that it went bad? Because I don't know, other than when I first set it aside, it was okay. And when I finally checked it, it was bad. I don't know when it went bad. Right? And so here what we're learning is, if he discovers that they were lost, then he must be concerned that the produce or money that he set aside was lost, quote, from the time until the time. And this will be explained in the Gemara, and this is the statement of Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Yehuda says, now wine also has to be tithed, so one checks the wine that is set aside to be used for separating teruma and tithes for other wine to see if it has turned to vinegar, right? Grain might be stolen, might blow away, might rot. Wine that is set aside for this purpose, wine generally lasts a long time, but it can go bad and it can turn to vinegar. So one checks the wine that is set aside for this purpose at 3 times during the year. What are the 3 times when one should check if his wine has turned to vinegar, particularly this wine that is being used as a supply for teruma and tithes of other wine? He should check it at 3 times of the year. When the east wind blows at the conclusion of the festival of Sukkot, and when the blossoms fall and the grape buds emerge and appear as small clusters, and at the time when water enters and fills the unripe grape. Since there is a change in the weather at these times, one should check to ensure that the wine has not turned into vinegar. Here comes the Gemara. The Mishna taught that if the produce or money was lost, then one must be concerned that it occurred from the time until the time. From the time until the time. And the Gemara asks, what is meant from the time until the time? And Rabbi Yochanan said it means from the time it was checked and found to be lost until the same time of day on the previous day. Right? In other words, you can assume that it was good up until 24 hours before when it was found to have spoiled. So if one had used that produce to render fit other produce within the 24 hours before noticing that it had been lost, then one must separate teruma and tithes from that produce again. Right? So it's a pretty lenient assumption. Right? You might have had this set aside for months. Then you find out it turned to vinegar or went bad somehow. And so according to this view, you only have to assume that it went bad in the last 24 hours before you checked it. If you used it to tithe produce during that last 24 hours, okay, you need to tithe that stuff again. But anything that you use that stack to tithe earlier than that, no matter how many months or years going back until when you first set it aside, that's going to be considered a valid tithe. If one had used that produce to render fit other produce within the 24 hours before noticing that it had been lost, one must separate teruma and tithes for that produce again. Rabbi Elazar ben Antigonus says, in the name of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Yanai, from the time until the time means from the time that it was set aside until the time on the day after it was set aside. In other words, he must be concerned about all of the untithed produce that he rendered fit after the first 24-hour period. This is a much more stringent view, right? Now he's saying you can only assume that that stack was good and you made a valid tithe by relying on it for the first 24 hours that it was in existence. And anything that you use to tithe after that, between when the end of that first 24-hour period when you first set it aside and however many days, weeks, months later you discover that it had gone bad, all of that period it was not a valid tithe, right? So the difference between these two views is huge. Now we learned in the Mishnah, and we're on 31b. We learned in the Mishnah, if he discovers that they were lost, then he must be concerned that the produce or money that he set aside was lost from the time until the time. Now granted, according to the one who said that from the time until the time means from the time it was checked and found to be lost until, the same time of day, 24 hours previously, at the last day of that period, this works out well, as the wine is presumed to have turned to vinegar from that moment. But according to the one who said that this means from the time it was set aside until the same time of day, 24 hours later, then this expression from the time until the time is very imprecise, as the presumption is that the wine turned to vinegar dating back to the day after it had been set aside. Therefore, it should have said one is concerned going back until then from the time it was set aside to the same time the next day. Why doesn't it say more specifically what it means when it says from the time until the time? And the Gemara comments, the wording of the Mishnah is difficult according to that opinion. So the Mishnah teaches that this is the statement of the Tana Rabbi Elazar. And the Amora, later rabbi from the Gemara period, also named Rabbi Elazar, says the earlier Rabbi Elazar's colleagues disagree with him. As we learned in a Mishnah, Mikvahos 2:2, in the case of a mikveh, a ritual bath that was known to have contained the requisite 40 sa, which is the minimum measure of water in a mikveh, and which was then measured and found deficient in its quantity of water. So all pure items that had been rendered pure by being immersed in that mikveh, retroactive to when the ritual bath was last measured, whether this mikveh is found in a private domain or in the public domain, are impure. Right? So if you used a mikveh to purify, let's say, metal or glass vessels in it, and then when you first put the water in, you knew that it had the minimum measure of water, and then sometime later you found out that there was not the minimum measure of water in it, then anything that you toiveled, anything that you immersed in the mikveh for the purpose of rendering it ritually pure, after the last time that you checked that it had the minimum measure of water, it's like you didn't purify those items and they're going to have to be purified again. Got this kind of performance undershirt, but it keeps crawling up my neck. Okay. Now the Gemara comments, it is obvious that those who ascribe to the statement of that Mishnah disagree with Rabbi Elazar the Tana. What novel idea is Rabbi Elazar the Amora teaching? The Gemara answers, it is necessary lest you say that the term retroactive is referring to any item that was immersed and purified from the time it was found to be deficient until the same time on the previous day, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar. Therefore, he teaches us that in fact they disagree and deem impure all items immersed from the time the ritual bath had been checked. In other words, at least if we look at the law of presumptions we can make about when a mikveh became an invalid mikveh because there was too little water in it, we take a very stringent view and say we can only assume that anything immersed in it was immersed properly from the time that it was last, known for sure to have that minimum measure, and anything immersed after that, we have to assume it was an invalid immersion. Now, if that's judging from that very stringent view of the presumption about what, when the mikveh went bad, as it were, because it had too little water in it, you might think that this, teruma, this anticipation of the tithe stack that we set aside that at some point went bad, maybe we should assume, like the stringent view, that we could only assume that anything that was tithed against it was tithed properly for the first 24 hours after we first set aside that stack of produce, and at some point after that it went bad and we don't know when, so we're going to take the most stringent view. But that's only one of the views that we've seen. The other view is much more lenient. Now, the Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Yehuda says, one checks the wine. If you set aside wine to act as the tithing wine for other wine that you're going to use later. So the Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Yehuda says, one checks the wine at 3 times during the year. One of these times is when the east wind blows at the conclusion of the festival of Sukkot, right? Sukkot is a fall festival. So if you imagine it in the Holy Land, very hot, right? Israel in the summer is hot. And then you move into the fall, and now you're going to start to get the east wind in the fall. And what about it? A sage taught it is checked when the east wind blows at the conclusion of the festival of Sukkot in the season of Tishrei, meaning autumn. However, if the summer continues until the festival of Sukkot, then in the event of this unusual occurrence, one does not check the wine, right? If we're saying that you need to check the wine when the winds change, that's what it sounds like, and the winds didn't change, okay, so you can wait till the winds do change. You don't have to check it at Sukkot if it's still the same, weather that we have during the summer. It's not that heat day after day after day after day is what's going to make the wine spoil. Rather, it's when the weather changes. You can kind of understand that, I think, from a little bit of a technical point of view. Consistent weather, you've checked before at the beginning of the hot season, okay, everything was fine. The fact that it's just hot day after day, there's no change. But when you have a change, a rapid temperature change, that's when the corks can get loose, that's when air can get in, that's when jars can crack. All kinds of things happen when the weather changes. Now, it is taught in a baraisa. Rabbi Yehuda says that at 3 times during the year, one sells the grain. Before the time of sowing, and during the time of the sowing, and before the festival of Passover. And at 3 times of the year, one sells the wine. Before the festival of Passover, and before the festival of Shavuos, and before the festival of Sukkot. And oil is sold from the festival of Shavuos and onward. And the Gemara asks, with regard to what law was this stated? One may sell these products whenever he so desires. And Rav has said, and some say that it was Rav Papa who said, this law was stated with regard to partners. As one partner may sell these products without the permission of the other, only at these times of the year. At other times, he must first receive permission from his partner. From this point forward, i.e., after the last of the 3 times has passed, what is the law? And Rava said, every day is its time to be sold. So what is this idea of selling at these 3 times of year? With regard to partners, Rashi explains that although usually one is not allowed to sell jointly owned produce without the permission of one's partner, at these times, right, in anticipation of the holidays, which are the fixed times of sale, it is permitted to do so and the other partner cannot raise objections even if the partners incurred a loss as a result of this sale. However, Rabbeinu Hananel and Rabbeinu Tam explain that it refers to the disbanding of a partnership. Each partner can prevent the other from disbanding the partnership until one of these times when it is possible to easily sell the produce. So having mentioned the east wind, the Gemara quotes a related verse from the book of Jonah. chapter 4, verse 8. And it came to pass when the sun arose that God prepared a vehement east wind, harishit. And the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the word harishit? And Rav Yehuda says it means a wind that plows, choreshet. As at the time that this wind blows, it forms many furrows in the sea, as though it were plowing the sea. You know, it's funny, we live in cities, we live in modern times, we tend to just say it's windy or it's not windy. But in agricultural people, just like you've heard, I remember they always told us when we were kids, right? The Eskimos have, 30 different words for snow, right? Because they care, because they live with the snow, because different snows mean different things, to their community. Some, foretell that a different type of snow may bring danger or it may bring comfort, etc. And likewise, these winds had very different characteristics, and the people were very tuned in, not just to the strength of the wind, the temperature of the wind, the scent of the wind, and of course the direction that the wind was coming from. I'm reminded of, I used to go to an acupuncturist, and this is Chinese medicine. My doctor was actually Korean. But one thing that people practiced in that type of medicine are very good at is feeling your pulse. And they're doing much, much more than counting beats per minute, right? I mean, practitioners of that kind of medicine, I think it takes them anything from like 10 to 15 years of experience before they're really qualified to feel your pulse. Because for them, there's so many different sensations that they get from feeling your pulse. They're incredibly sensitive, and they can tell a lot about what's going on inside of you, and your digestion, and your nervous system, your muscular system. All kinds of information is available to them because they've developed this extreme sensitivity when feeling your pulse. So likewise, think these farmers in ancient Israel, they were very plugged in to what was exactly going on with the different winds. And that's why all these different adjectives, they weren't just being poetic, they were being very specific about what that kind of wind would mean to their livelihood as farmers. So Rabbah said to him, right, to Rav Yehuda, Rabbah said to him, if that is so, then that which is written in the continuation of the verse, and the sun beat upon the head of Jonah and he fainted. Well, this is difficult. It seems from the continuation of the verse that the wind was extremely hot, not strong. So rather, Rabbah says, at the time that it blows, it silences all the winds before it. Therefore, it is called harishit, because all other winds are silent, macharishot, before it. So since only this wind was blowing, it became very hot. And this is as it is written, you whose garments are hot, when the earth is still by reason of the south wind. Job 37:17. Now, Rabbi Tachalifa bar Rav Chisda says, in explanation of this verse, when are your garments hot? I.e., when is there the greatest heat? It is when the earth is still by reason of the south wind, as at the time that the southern wind blows, it silences all the winds before it. And the Gemara relates that Rav Huna and Rav Chisda were sitting, and Geneva passed by them. And one said to the other, let us stand before him, as he is a son of Torah. And the others said to him, shall we stand before a quarrelsome person? In the meantime, Geneva came to them and said to them, with what were you dealing when you were sitting together? And they said to him, we were dealing with the winds. Right? We were discussing the winds. And he said to them, right? Geneva said to them, this is what Rav Hanan bar Rava says, that Rav says, 4 winds blow on each day, and the north wind blows together with each of the other 3. As if this were not so, and the northern wind did not blow, then the world would not survive for even 1 hour. And the south wind is harsher than all of them, and were it not for the angel called Ben Netz, who stops it from blowing even harder, then it would destroy the entire world before it. As it is stated, does the hawk Netz soar by your wisdom and stretch her wings toward the south? And the Gemara also relates that Rav and Rav Nachman bar Yitzhak were sitting, and Rav Nachman bar Yaakov was passing by them while sitting on a gilt carriage. and with a green cloak, sarbella spread over him. And Rava went to him, but Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak did not go to him. And he said, perhaps they are members of the house of the Exarch. Rava needs them, but I do not need them. I'm going to just read that again. Right, so let's just remember. Rav Huna and Rav Chisda were sitting, and this quarrelsome fellow sage named Geneva passed by them and asked them what they were talking about. And they said they were talking about the winds. So Geneva says to them, this is what Rav Chanan bar Rava says, that Rav says 4 winds blow on each day, and thank God the north wind blows with all the other winds, because if it didn't, the world would be destroyed. And now the Gemara relates that Rava and Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak were sitting, and Rav Nachman bar Yaakov was passing by them while sitting on a gilt carriage and with a green cloak spread over him. And Rava went to him, but Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak did not go to him. Right? So 2 were talking. One went out to greet the new sage that comes along, and the other doesn't. And he said, perhaps they are members of the house of the Exarch. Rava needs them, but I do not need them. And when he saw that it was Rav Nachman bar Yaakov, he also went to him. So Rav Nachman bar Yaakov uncovered his arm due to the heat, and he said, the wind called Shadia is blowing. And Rava says, this is what Rav says about this wind, a woman miscarries in its wake. And Shmuel said, even a pearl that is in the sea decomposes in its wake. And Rabbi Yochanan says, even the semen that is in a woman's womb putrefies in its wake. This is an unhealthy wind that they are talking about. Again, they were very specific with different types of wind. So for them, they were very familiar with the kind of wind that we're now talking about. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, who was present, said about their statements. And the 3 of them derived their statements from one verse. As it is stated, Hosea 13:15, for though he be fruitful among the reed plants, an east wind shall come, the wind of the Lord coming up from the wilderness, and his spring shall become dry, and his fountain shall be dried up, and he shall spoil the treasure of all the precious vessels. It's funny because, here in LA, we do live in a city, but we are actually quite familiar with the winds here because they have a very different nature. The prevailing breeze, as it were, is coming in off the Pacific Ocean. So it's a west wind, right? Coming from the west, coming over the city, cooling it down. And that's a kind of steady wind that's always there. From time to time, we get an east wind, which we call a Santa Ana's here, which is a hot wind coming out of the desert, east of the city, over the city. That's a very hot, dry wind, and when it blows, it's noisy, it's incessant, and the people get very irritable in LA. South wind tends to be balmy, sometimes very, very strong and kind of a little bit dangerous, but generally south wind is okay. It's balmy, nice and warm. North wind, when it comes to LA, is a crazy wind. When you get a north wind in LA, anything could happen, at any rate. So here they're talking about in the Holy Land, right? So the east wind, likewise, like the west wind would be coming in off the Mediterranean, nice, right? Cooling the land of milk and honey. East wind coming out of the desert, east of the land, right? So, and now here you're hearing it from the prophet Hosea, that when that east wind comes, he's speaking a little bit metaphorically, that you should never get presumptuous because you have a lot of blessings in your life. That east wind could come at any moment and dry you up, as it were, if you're not expressing proper gratitude to Hashem. Now, the statement that a woman miscarries in its wake is based on the phrase, his spring shall become dry, as this is referring to a woman's womb. And with regard to the phrase, and his fountain shall be dried up, this is referring to the semen that is in a woman's womb, right, which would normally, cause a baby to form there, and maybe now it won't because of this wind. And with regard to the phrase, he shall spoil the treasure of all precious vessels, and this is referring even to the pearls that are in the sea, is how dangerous that east wind is. And Rava says, this sage is from Surah, as they are precise with their verses. And the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of, though he be fruitful, Yafri, among the reed plants? And Rava said, I'm almost done. We're almost done with this chapter. Even the handle in the hole, kofina, the handle in the hole of the hoe, the handle in the hole of the hoe, H-O-E, farm implement, becomes loose as he understands the word yafri to refer to separating connected items. And similarly, Rav Yosef said, even the peg hammered into the wall becomes loose. And Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said, even the reed woven into the basket becomes loose. And that concludes chapter 3 here in Tractate Gittin. But you get the feeling, right, that there are certain winds and certain times of year, certain, seasons that don't always come, but when they do, watch out. Watch out. People are going to start to go nutty. Things are going to start breaking down. If you're entering into such a season, so that might be a time for, enhanced caution, enhanced devotion, a bit of extra prayer, a bit of extra looking to the Lord, because everyone gets affected by these irritable winds, as it were. Okay, let's go to some questions or comments here on page 31 and the conclusion of chapter 3. Bill, even now, speaking as someone who grew up in an agricultural community, rural people in the U.S. have a number of different phrases for different kinds of rainstorms. For example, the last rain we had here in mid-Missouri was a toad strangler, a sudden, sharp, heavy, but brief rain. That is a great phrase, a toad strangler. Thank you, Bill, for sharing. And may you not have too many toad stranglers. Renee is telling us that she's familiar with gully washers. Wow, we have toad stranglers and gully washers. This is awesome. Sharon, the second paragraph of the Shema defines the different rains in different places. Why are we not particular with which wind we pray for in the Amidah? Right? When we say that God causes the rain to fall and the wind to blow. And presumably we mean the gentle wind, the healthy rain, etc. And why don't we just ask God for the gentle wind, right? The good wind. It's very interesting. That's a great question, Sharon. I suppose what we're saying there is, I'm not sure. It's a great question, so I'm just speculating now. But I do remember reading years ago a book. Nina will remind me. I think it was written by a doctor named Larry Dossey, maybe. And it was kind of a medical study of prayer. The effectiveness of prayer on people's health. Right? And so I remember that in that book, they had this study that was once done that they asked nuns to pray, for the health of bacteria in petri dishes. Obviously, the bacteria don't know they're being prayed for, but there was the controlled bacteria that wasn't being prayed for, and the subject bacteria that was being prayed for, and it flourished. Right? Somehow prayer had an effect even on non-intelligent animals. How much more would it affect people that are being prayed for? And I remember it also said in that book that the people who tended to be the healthiest, had, in terms of the spiritual component in their lives, were people who felt a lot of gratitude, and who would, sort of pray for the best, but accept God's judgments as well. That they would say, okay, I trust God. Whatever God is sending me, it's somehow for the best. A little bit like we've seen in the Talmud, Gamzu Latova. And having that attitude of, I trust God, and right now things might be difficult for me, but who knows, maybe this is setting me up for something later that wouldn't happen to me if I wasn't having this misfortune now, so I accept. So maybe, we're not going to tell God his business and tell him when to send us. again, we are always praying, for health, for meaning, for prosperity, all kinds of things that we ask God for, and it's good to do that. But we also want to maintain this attitude of, and whatever God sends me, I'm good with that. I trust you, God. And so maybe in terms of winds, which are directly in God, everything's in God's control, but the wind is so closely associated with God's control that perhaps we're not going to be too specific. I'm just guessing. I don't know, but it's a great question. That's what I've got for us today, my holy sisters and brothers. Great to be learning with you on the day I turn 58. Do I feel a little wiser today? No, but I hope to feel a little wiser. I know, I do feel a little wiser because we learn together. And that makes us a little bit wiser every day, thank God. Okay, so tomorrow night, Saturday, I think might be the latest Shabbos of the year. It's either this week or next week. I'll try to get on as soon as I can after Shabbos ends. Something like 9:30 p.m. here in LA. By the way, this is Shabbos Mevarchim. So during Shabbos, in our prayers, we'll be blessing the new Hebrew month, which is about to begin next week. And then we'll have Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, right? So Tammuz is coming. That's the next month as we emerge from the month we're in now, which is Sivan. Tammuz has a fast in it, right? In the 17th of the month. And then we begin the 3 weeks as we start to, commemorate that part in the calendar, the Hebrew calendar, as we approach the destruction of Jerusalem and the temples on the 9th of Av. Av is the month after Tammuz. But we don't get to that till the 17th of Tammuz. So let's really try and enjoy these first couple weeks of the summer month of Tammuz. All the best, and look forward to learning with you, God willing, tomorrow night. A Gittin Erev Shabbos to you.